The sun melted into the horizon off Monterey Bay, painting the sky with streaks of amber and purple that reflected across the still waters. Frank Wilson, a weathered fisherman with leathery skin and tired eyes, was steering his boat's second wind back to harbor when he spotted something impossible, a dark shape struggling against the waves nearly 3 miles offshore. "Good Lord Almighty," Frank whispered, his calloused hand adjusting the throttle. "What's a dog doing out here in the middle of nowhere?" A German shepherd, fur-matted and waterlogged, fought desperately to keep its head above water. Frank maneuvered closer, hearing the animal's exhausted whimpers, sounds that seemed almost human in their desperation. When Frank pulled the trembling dog aboard, he noticed something in its intelligent brown eyes, not just fear or relief, but urgency. The dog staggered to its feet, barking weakly toward the distant horizon. "What is it, boy? What are you trying to tell me?" Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Frank's weathered hands trembled slightly as he wrapped the shivering German shepherd in an old wool blanket he kept stowed beneath the steering console. The dog's wet fur had soaked through his flannel shirt, but Frank barely noticed the chill creeping across his own skin. After 43 years on these waters, he'd seen strange things. Whales breaching close enough to shower his deck with spray, schools of luminescent jellyfish lighting up midnight waters like underwater stars. But never a dog swimming miles from shore with such desperate purpose. "Easy there, fella," Frank murmured, his voice rusty from disuse. 3 years since Martha passed, and some days he barely spoke more than a dozen words. Just him and the seagulls, and the endless conversation of waves against hull. The dog's breathing gradually steadied, but those intelligent brown eyes never stopped watching Frank's face. There was something unnerving about that gaze, too knowing, too human. The collar around the dog's neck was high-quality leather, partially damaged by salt water. Frank thumbed the metal tag, wiping away brine to reveal the name Rex and what looked like a phone number, though several digits had been worn away by the ocean. "Rex, huh?" Frank said. The dog's ears perked up immediately. "Well, Rex, you're about the luckiest dog alive. Another hour out here." He didn't finish the thought. The sun had fully set now, the horizon a thin line of dying light. Frank should head back. He had frozen dinners in the icebox and reruns of Gunsmoke waiting at his empty cottage on the bluff. The sensible thing would be to take the dog to shore. Try to contact its owner tomorrow. Yet something held him back. Rex had struggled to his feet and was standing at the bow, staring intently out to sea, then turning to look at Frank with an almost human expression of impatience. A low whine escaped the dog's throat, followed by a sharp bark. "What is it, boy?" Frank asked, feeling foolish talking to an animal but unable to ignore the obvious distress. "You trying to tell me something?" Rex barked again, more insistent this time, then pawed at the side of the boat facing deeper water. Frank checked his watch, checked his fuel gauge. He had enough to go further out and still make it back. "This is crazy," he muttered to himself. "Martha would say I've finally lost my marbles." But in the 3 years since he'd buried his wife of 42 years, Frank had learned to trust his instincts on the water. And every instinct told him this wasn't just a lost dog. "All right, Rex," Frank said, adjusting his faded blue captain's hat. "You want me to follow you out there? I must be going senile. But let's see what's got you so worked up." He turned the key and the engine rumbled to life. The dog's tail wagged once and those intelligent eyes seemed to say, "Hurry." 2 months earlier, Emily Winters stood on the deck of the research vessel Oceanic Explorer, her blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, watching Rex trot confidently along the railing. At 35, she had earned a reputation as one of the most dedicated marine biologists on the West Coast. but few of her colleagues understood her insistence on bringing her German Shepherd on every expedition. "I still don't get why the dog needs to be here," James Parker said, joining her at the railing. Tall, with salt and pepper hair that made him look distinguished despite being only 40, James had been her research partner for the past 3 years. "This isn't exactly standard research protocol." Emily smiled, watching Rex pause to sniff the air, his powerful muscles rippling beneath his black and tan coat. "Rex isn't standard either. 3 tours in Afghanistan as a military service dog before he was retired due to a shrapnel injury. The Navy program trained him for marine research after that. He can detect chemical changes in water that our instruments sometimes miss. Plus," she added, scratching behind Rex's ears when he trotted back to her side, "he's saved my life twice. Once when I nearly drowned after slipping on some rocks during coastal sampling, and once when he alerted me to a gas leak in my apartment at 3 in the morning." James raised an eyebrow. "So he's a war hero, a research assistant, and a smoke detector. Impressive resume." "Don't forget loyal companion," Emily said, feeling the familiar warmth of Rex leaning against her leg. "After my divorce, there were some dark days. Rex got me through them." She didn't elaborate, and James didn't press. Her divorce from Mark 3 years ago had been brutal. A promising surgeon who'd decided his career trajectory didn't include a wife who disappeared for weeks on research vessels. The custody battle for Rex had been the final blow, with Mark claiming the dog despite having no real attachment to him. Emily had won only because her neighbor testified about Mark kicking Rex when he thought no one was looking. "The readings are getting stronger," James said, checking the tablet in his hand. "The underwater thermal activity has increased by 17% since yesterday." Emily frowned, taking the tablet. "That's concerning. If there's significant magma movement beneath that underwater ridge—" "Let's not jump to conclusions," James cautioned. "Could be perfectly normal fluctuations. That's why we're out here, right? To gather more data." Rex suddenly stood alert, ears forward, eyes focused on the horizon. A low growl rumbled in his throat. "What is it, boy?" Emily asked, instantly attentive. She'd learned to trust Rex's instincts above almost everything else. "Probably saw a sea lion," James said dismissively. But the sky to the west was darkening with unnatural speed, clouds building and swirling in a pattern Emily had never seen before. The air pressure seemed to drop suddenly, making her ears pop. "That's not normal," she said, pointing. "We need to alert the captain." By the time they reached the bridge, the first winds had hit. Captain Michael Brooks, a veteran of 30 years at sea, took one look at the approaching storm front and immediately ordered all equipment secured and all personnel below decks. "But we need to collect more data," Emily protested. "This could be connected to the thermal activity." "No data's worth risking lives, Dr. Winters," Captain Brooks said firmly. "This system formed too fast, moving too erratically. I've never seen anything like it." Within 20 minutes, the Oceanic Explorer was being tossed like a toy in 30-foot swells. Emily huddled in her cabin, arms wrapped around Rex, who remained preternaturally calm despite the violent pitching of the vessel. The research vessel was built to withstand rough seas, but the storm that had materialized seemingly out of nowhere was testing its limits. A particularly massive wave struck the port side. The lights flickered, then went out. Emergency lighting came on, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. Then came the sound no sailor ever wants to hear, the deep, resonant crack of a hull breach. The ship's alarm blared. Emily grabbed her emergency pack and Rex's special life vest, a custom-made flotation device she'd insisted on, and strapped it securely around his powerful chest. "Emergency stations! All hands to emergency stations!" The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Prepare to abandon ship." The corridor outside her cabin was already filling with water. Emily fought her way toward the stairs, Rex swimming powerfully beside her. They emerged onto the tilting deck where crew members were desperately trying to deploy life rafts in the howling wind and massive waves. James appeared at her side, soaking wet and bleeding from a cut on his forehead. "Emily, here!" He thrust a waterproof case into her hands. "The data drives, all our research. It needs to get back to the Institute." She stuffed the case into her emergency pack just as a towering wave crashed over the deck, sweeping 3 crew members overboard. The ship lurched sickeningly, listing heavily to port. They were going down fast. "The life rafts are gone!" someone shouted over the roar of the storm. Emily looked at Rex, whose eyes were fixed on hers with absolute trust. She secured her emergency pack and checked his life vest one more time. "We have to swim for it, boy," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Stay with me." Another wave crashed over them. Emily felt herself being torn away from the railing, plunging into the frigid Pacific. The cold shocked the breath from her lungs. She surfaced, gasping, searching frantically for Rex. Relief flooded her when she saw him swimming strongly a few yards away, heading toward her. Lightning illuminated the scene in stark flashes, the research vessel now nearly vertical, its bow pointing skyward before it slipped beneath the waves. Debris floated everywhere. Emily spotted a large section of what looked like the ship's mess hall table and swam toward it, Rex at her side. With tremendous effort, she pulled herself onto the makeshift raft. Rex tried to climb up too, but the wood shifted dangerously under his weight. "Stay in the water, Rex," she commanded. "Hold on to the edge." For hours they drifted, the storm gradually subsiding as mysteriously as it had appeared. By dawn the sea had calmed to gentle swells, but the situation remained dire. No other survivors were visible. Emily's emergency pack contained a water pouch, energy bars, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, and a whistle, enough to keep her alive for perhaps 2 days. And somewhere in that pack was the data that could warn coastal communities if her suspicions about the thermal activity were correct. Emily's scientific mind calculated their odds clinically. They were miles from shore, off their planned course due to the storm. The emergency locator beacon on the ship would have activated, but search patterns would focus on their original location. The current was pulling them further from shipping lanes. Rex couldn't stay in the water indefinitely, even with his life vest. As the sun rose higher, bringing punishing heat, Emily made the hardest decision of her life. She unzipped her pack and retrieved the emergency GPS locator she always carried. A small device with limited battery life, but powerful enough to be detected by search and rescue if they were in the right area. "Rex," she said, her voice cracking as she secured the device to his collar. "You need to find help." The German shepherd looked at her with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand everything. "I know it's far," Emily continued, fighting back tears. "But you're strong and you're smart. Find land, find people." She pointed west, where the California coast lay beyond the horizon. "Go get help, Rex. Go!" Rex hesitated, whining softly, clearly reluctant to leave her. "It's okay," she said, stroking his wet fur. "I'll be right here, I promise. Go get help, boy. It's our only chance." With one last look that seemed to contain a solemn promise, Rex turned and began swimming steadily westward, his powerful legs driving him through the water with determined grace. Emily watched until he was just a small dot on the vast ocean, then finally allowed herself to cry. "Come back to me," she whispered. "Please come back with help." Frank guided his boat deeper into the darkening ocean, following the German shepherd's cues with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Rex stood at the bow, his posture alert despite his obvious exhaustion, occasionally turning to ensure Frank was maintaining course before facing forward again with intense focus. "This is about the craziest thing I've done since I tried to outrun that nor'easter back in '86, Frank muttered, adjusting his cap. The rational part of his brain argued that he should turn back. Night fishing was one thing, but heading miles further offshore based on a dog's behavior was asking for trouble. Yet, something in Rex's demeanor, the urgent intelligence in those amber eyes, compelled him onward. The last violet traces of dusk had vanished entirely, leaving only the encompassing darkness of the open ocean at night. Frank switched on his navigation lights and the powerful spotlight mounted on the cabin roof. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of gentle swells that stretched endlessly before them. The night was unusually still, no wind, the water almost glassy, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. "Not much further, boy," Frank said, checking his fuel gauge. "Another mile and we turn back, rescue mission or not." Rex suddenly tensed, ears forward, and let out a sharp bark that startled Frank. The dog's tail wagged once, then he began pawing at the gunwale and whining with renewed urgency. "You see something?" Frank swung the spotlight in the direction Rex was indicating, sweeping the beam across the dark water. At first, he saw nothing but empty ocean. Then, as he was about to give up, the light caught something, a faint reflection that didn't match the pattern of the waves. "Well, I'll be," Frank murmured, adjusting course toward the anomaly. As they drew closer, the spotlight revealed what appeared to be debris, fragments of white fiberglass and wood floating in a loose cluster. "Looks like a shipwreck." Rex's barking intensified, the sound piercing the night stillness. The dog was practically dancing now, moving from one side of the bow to the other, his exhaustion seemingly forgotten in his excitement. Frank maneuvered carefully among the floating debris, mindful of his propeller. "Hello?" he called out, more out of protocol than expectation. "Anyone out there?" The silence that followed seemed to mock him, until it was broken by a faint sound that made the hairs on the back of Frank's neck stand up. "Help!" The voice was so weak he almost thought he'd imagined it. Frank swung the spotlight frantically, heart pounding. "Where are you? Call out again." "Here." The voice was slightly stronger this time, coming from beyond a large piece of what looked like a ship's table. Frank carefully guided his boat around the obstacle, and the spotlight beam fell upon a sight that would be forever etched in his memory. A woman, pale and clearly exhausted, clinging to a makeshift raft fashioned from what appeared to be part of a deck or bulkhead. Her blonde hair was plastered to her head, her lips had a bluish tinge, and her eyes squinted painfully against the sudden light. Rex gave a joyful bark that seemed to contain all the relief and triumph in the world, his tail wagging frantically. The woman's eyes widened in disbelief. "Rex?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Oh my God, Rex!" Understanding dawned on Frank with the force of a physical blow. The dog hadn't been lost. He'd been on a mission. He'd swum miles through open ocean not to save himself, but to find help for his owner. "Hang on, ma'am," Frank called, already moving to secure his boat. "I'm coming to get you." Bringing the woman aboard proved challenging. She was so weak she could barely hold on to the life ring Frank tossed her, and it took all his strength to pull her from the water. Rex paced anxiously on deck, whining until the woman was safely aboard, then immediately pressed his body against hers as Frank wrapped her in his emergency blankets. "Thank you," she managed, teeth chattering violently. "Can't believe Rex found someone." "Name's Frank Wilson," he said, helping her to the small, sheltered area behind the wheelhouse. "Your dog is something else, ma'am. Never seen anything like it." "Emily," she whispered. "Emily Winters. We were research vessel. Storm came so fast." "Save your strength," Frank advised, cranking the engine. "We need to get you to shore and medical attention. You're suffering from exposure." Emily clutched at his arm with surprising strength. "Wait," she gasped. "My pack. The data. Important." Frank spotted the pack still attached to the makeshift raft. With some maneuvering, he managed to hook it with his gaff and haul it aboard. Emily relaxed slightly when he handed it to her, her blue-tinged fingers clutching it to her chest. Need to warn. Thermal activity. Prediction models. Her eyes were becoming unfocused, her words slurring. Frank recognized the signs of advanced hypothermia and knew they were running out of time. He radioed the Coast Guard immediately, reporting a shipwreck survivor in critical condition. This is fishing vessel Second Wind, approximately 7 miles west of Monterey Bay. I've recovered a shipwreck survivor, female, suffering severe hypothermia. Need immediate medical assistance upon docking. The Coast Guard response was immediate. Roger that, Second Wind. We'll have emergency services standing by at Monterey Harbor East Dock. What's your ETA? Frank calculated quickly. About 40 minutes at full throttle. Copy that. Can you provide details on the vessel that went down? Frank glanced at Emily, who was now slipping in and out of consciousness despite Rex's efforts to keep her awake by nuzzling and licking her face. Research vessel is all I know. Survivor's name is Emily Winters. She's mentioned something about important data and thermal activity, but she's in bad shape. There was a pause on the other end. Did you say Emily Winters? From the Monterey Oceanographic Institute? Don't know about that, but the name's Emily Winters for sure. Stand by, Second Wind. The radio went silent for nearly a minute before crackling back to life. We're dispatching a high-speed intercept vessel to your coordinates. They'll have medical personnel aboard. Continue toward harbor. They'll meet you en route. Frank acknowledged and set course for Monterey Harbor at his boat's maximum speed, the engine protesting the strain. He made Emily as comfortable as possible, elevating her feet and continuing to add layers of blankets. Rex remained glued to her side, his body heat providing additional warmth. As they raced through the darkness, Emily briefly regained consciousness, her eyes finding Frank's face. Rex swam. For help, she whispered. I know, Frank said gently. He found me. You're going to be all right. She shook her head weakly. Not just me. The data. Thermal vent activity. Potential tsunami trigger. Her hand clutched at the waterproof pack. Warned them. Wouldn't listen. Need proof. Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. A tsunami? You're saying there's a tsunami coming? Emily's eyes were clearer now, urgent. Unusual thermal activity. Underground fissure. Expanding rapidly. Our models show less than 24 hours. Before she could elaborate, lights appeared on the horizon, the Coast Guard intercept vessel approaching at high speed. Within minutes, they were alongside, and a medical team was transferring Emily to their boat. Rex refused to leave her side, growling at anyone who tried to separate them until Emily weakly patted his head and whispered something in his ear. A Coast Guard officer approached Frank. Thank you for your assistance, sir. We'll take it from here. Wait, Frank said, unable to shake Emily's urgent warning. She mentioned something about a tsunami threat. Said there's less than 24 hours. She has data in her pack that proves it. The officer's expression remained professionally neutral. We'll make sure her information gets to the right people, Mr. Wilson. As the Coast Guard vessel pulled away, Frank watched Rex standing protectively beside Emily's stretcher, his mission completed but his vigilance undiminished. Something told Frank this wasn't over. Not for Emily, not for Rex, and somehow not for him either. He turned his boat toward Monterey Harbor, but instead of the relief he expected to feel, a nagging sense of unfinished business settled in his gut. 24 hours, a tsunami warning that someone hadn't taken seriously, and a dog who had swum miles through open ocean to save not just his owner, but perhaps countless others as well. This ain't over by a long shot, Frank muttered to the empty night as the lights of Monterey began to twinkle on the horizon. The fluorescent lights of Monterey Peninsula Hospital cast harsh shadows across the small waiting room where Frank sat, his weathered hands fidgeting with the brim of his captain's hat. 3 hours had passed since they'd brought Emily Winters ashore, the Coast Guard medics working frantically to stabilize her as they rushed to the emergency room. Frank had followed in his truck, driven by an inexplicable sense of responsibility that he couldn't shake. A soft whine drew his attention to the large German shepherd sitting beside his chair. Rex had been reluctant to leave Emily's side, but hospital regulations were firm. It had taken a nurse with a soft spot for animals to bend the rules, allowing Rex to wait in the reception area rather than be taken to animal control. "She's gonna be okay, boy," Frank said softly, reaching down to scratch behind Rex's ears. "Tough lady, your owner." The dog leaned into his touch, those intelligent amber eyes looking up at Frank with what seemed like gratitude. Still, the animal remained alert, head turning toward the double doors every time they swung open. Frank was about to check with the reception desk again when the doors opened to reveal a tall man in a white coat, his expression professionally neutral as he scanned the waiting room. "Mr. Wilson," the doctor called. Frank stood immediately, Rex rising beside him. "That's me. How is she?" The doctor approached, extending his hand. "I'm Dr. Lawrence. Dr. Winters is stable. She was suffering from severe hypothermia, dehydration, and exhaustion, but we've managed to bring her core temperature up. She's asking for you. And her dog." "She's conscious?" Frank asked, surprised. "And remarkably lucid given what she's been through." The doctor's expression softened slightly. "She says you saved her life." Frank shook his head. "All I did was steer the boat. This fellow here," he gestured toward Rex, "he's the real hero. Swam miles through open ocean to find help." Dr. Lawrence glanced down at Rex with newfound respect. "Extraordinary. Well, she's insistent on seeing you both. Normally we wouldn't allow animals, but—" He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "There are some government officials here who seem very interested in speaking with Dr. Winters. They've been rather forceful. Having you present might help keep things civil." A knot of concern tightened in Frank's stomach. "Government officials?" "Room 217, Dr. Lawrence said, already turning away. 5 minutes only, please. She needs rest." Frank and Rex followed the signs to the second floor. Outside room 217, 2 men in dark suits stood conversing in low tones. They fell silent as Frank approached, their expressions professionally blank. "Excuse me," Frank said, keeping his tone polite despite the immediate dislike he felt for these men with their crisp suits and cold eyes. "I'm here to see Dr. Winters." The taller of the 2 men stepped forward. "And you are?" "Frank Wilson. I'm the one who found her." The men exchanged glances. "Mr. Wilson, I'm Agent Dawson with the Department of Homeland Security. We're conducting an interview with Dr. Winters regarding some claims she's made. Perhaps you could wait until we're finished?" It wasn't really a question, but Frank had spent 40 years as his own boss on the open ocean and wasn't about to be intimidated by a suit. "Doctor said she's asking for me," he replied firmly. "And this here's her dog. Don't reckon she'll be too cooperative without seeing him first." Agent Dawson's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the door opened and a nurse appeared. "Dr. Winters is becoming agitated," she said, her tone making it clear where her priorities lay. "She's demanding to see someone named Frank and her dog. Doctor's orders are to keep her calm." Frank didn't wait for permission, brushing past the agents with Rex at his heels. Inside the room, Emily lay propped up against pillows, an IV line in her arm and color finally returning to her face. Her eyes lit up when she saw them. "Rex!" she exclaimed, voice still weak but filled with emotion as the German shepherd rushed to her bedside, placing his front paws carefully on the edge of the mattress to nuzzle her face. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she buried her fingers in his fur. You brilliant, amazing boy." After a moment, she looked up at Frank, her eyes now serious despite the tears. "And you must be Frank. Thank you for trusting him, for saving me." Frank shifted uncomfortably under her gratitude. "Just doing what anyone would do, ma'am." "Emily, please," she insisted. "And no, not anyone would head miles offshore at sunset following a dog's directions." She glanced toward the door. "I'm guessing you've met my unwelcome visitors?" Frank nodded. "Said they're from Homeland Security. Something about claims you've made?" Emily's expression hardened. "They don't believe me. Or rather, they don't want to believe me." She lowered her voice. "Did they take my pack? The waterproof one?" "Coast Guard has it, I think," Frank replied. "You mentioned something about a tsunami warning on the boat. That what this is about?" Emily gestured for him to come closer. "The research vessel I was on, the Oceanic Explorer, we were monitoring unusual thermal activity along an underwater fault line. My data shows that pressure is building rapidly. The resulting seafloor displacement could generate a significant tsunami within the next 18 hours. Frank felt his blood run cold. "You're certain?" "As certain as science allows," she replied. "But without the complete data set from my pack to run through the Institute's prediction models, the authorities won't issue an evacuation order. The economic impact of a false alarm." She trailed off, frustration evident in her voice. The door opened, and Agent Dawson entered, followed by his colleague and a third man in a rumpled suit who carried himself with academic authority. "Dr. Winters," Dawson began, "this is Dr. Richard Hargrove from the National Weather Service. He's reviewed your preliminary findings and has some concerns." Dr. Hargrove stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. "Dr. Winters, while your dedication is commendable, the data you've provided is simply insufficient to warrant the kind of response you're suggesting. The probability calculations were run on incomplete data," Emily interrupted, her voice stronger now. "The full data set is in my pack, including readings taken just before the storm hit that show exponential acceleration of thermal activity. Even if that's true," Hargrove continued smoothly, "the models for tsunami generation from thermal expansion are theoretical at best. Without seismic confirmation, there won't be significant seismic activity until it's too late," Emily insisted. "The thermal expansion is causing microfractures that won't register on your equipment until the critical point is reached. By then, we'll have minutes, not hours." Frank watched the exchange with growing unease. The academic argument was beyond his expertise, but he recognized the politics at play. Tourism season was at its peak along the California coast. An evacuation order would cost millions, and if nothing happened, careers would end. "Where is my pack?" Emily demanded. "I need access to a computer to run the complete dataset through our models." Agent Dawson's expression remained impassive. "Your personal effects are being examined as part of our investigation into the sinking of the Oceanic Explorer." Emily's face paled. "Investigation? The storm capsized us. It formed suddenly, with unusual intensity." "So you've claimed," Dawson replied. "However, Captain Brooks filed a report just before the incident indicating concerns about unauthorized equipment modifications that may have compromised the vessel's stability." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Frank saw Emily's hands clench into fists, saw the flash of betrayal in her eyes. "That's absurd," she whispered. "Michael would never—" "The captain's report specifically mentioned your research partner, Dr. James Parker, making unauthorized adjustments to stabilized equipment on the lower deck," Dawson continued relentlessly. Emily shook her head. "James wouldn't, unless—" She stopped, a new understanding dawning in her eyes. "Unless he was trying to discredit my findings." "Oh, God." "What do you mean?" Frank asked, stepping closer to the bed. Emily looked up at him, her expression grim. 3 days before we sailed, James and I argued about my preliminary findings. He said I was being alarmist, that publishing such dramatic predictions could damage our funding prospects. He wanted to modify the data to show a more gradual progression. She turned back to the agents. You need to understand, James recently accepted a consulting position with Pacific Coastal Development. They're breaking ground on a billion-dollar resort project in Carmel next month. An evacuation order, even a false alarm, would spook investors. Dr. Hargrove scoffed. That's quite an accusation, Dr. Winters. Dr. Parker is a respected scientist with an impeccable reputation. Where is James now? Emily demanded. Agent Dawson consulted his phone briefly. Dr. Parker was rescued by a passing vessel shortly after the Oceanic Explorer went down. He's currently at the Oceanographic Institute, assisting with the investigation. He has access to the Institute's systems, Emily said urgently. If he modifies the baseline data before I can run my new readings through the models— Dr. Winters, Dawson interrupted, his tone condescending. You've been through a traumatic experience. It's natural to seek explanations, even scapegoats. But making unfounded accusations against colleagues— Frank had heard enough. Seems to me, he said, his quiet voice cutting through the tension, that it wouldn't hurt to run the lady's data through these models she's talking about. Worst case, nothing happens, and you all look thorough. Best case, you prevent a disaster. It's not that simple, Mr. Wilson, Dr. Hargrove replied. False tsunami warnings can cause panic, economic disruption, and real tsunamis can kill thousands, Frank finished flatly. I've spent my life on these waters. Never seen a dog swim miles through open ocean to find help. Never seen a scientist fight this hard to be heard. Seems worth listening to. A tense silence fell over the room, broken only by the steady beep of Emily's heart monitor. Finally, Agent Dawson spoke. Dr. Winters needs to rest. We'll continue this discussion tomorrow morning. As they turned to leave, Emily called out, Check the data drives in my pack. The readings are time-stamped. If James has altered the baseline at the Institute, the discrepancy will be obvious. The door closed behind them, leaving Emily, Frank, and Rex alone in the suddenly quiet room. Emily slumped back against her pillows, exhaustion evident in every line of her face. They're not going to listen, she whispered. Not in time. Frank studied her face, weighing his next words carefully. In his long life, he'd learned to trust his instincts about people even more than his instincts about the sea. And everything in him said Emily Winters was telling the truth. Then we'll have to make them listen, he said simply. Emily's eyes widened in surprise. We? Frank nodded, reaching down to scratch Rex behind the ears. This old dog threw in with you, he said with a slight smile. Reckon I might as well do the same. For the first time since he'd pulled her from the ocean, Emily Winters smiled. A tired, grateful smile that reached her eyes and made Frank suddenly very certain he was making the right choice. I need to get to the Institute, she said, determination replacing despair in her voice. I need my data drives and access to our systems. You need rest first, Frank countered. No use trying to save the coast if you collapse in the process. Emily's expression softened. You're right. A few hours sleep, and then— She glanced at her watch, anxiety returning. We have less than 18 hours before the critical threshold is reached, if the models are correct. Get some sleep, Frank said, rising from his chair. I'll be back at dawn. We'll figure this out. As he headed for the door, Rex remained by Emily's bedside, clearly unwilling to leave her again. Emily looked up at Frank, a question in her eyes. Don't worry, Frank assured her. I'll smooth things over with the nurses. He's earned the right to stay. As Frank Wilson walked out of the hospital into the cool Monterey night, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. a sense of purpose beyond the daily routine of survival that had defined his existence since Martha's death. Tomorrow would bring challenges he couldn't yet imagine, but for the first time in a long time, Frank wasn't facing the future alone, and somehow that made all the difference. The pre-dawn light cast long shadows across Monterey Harbor as Frank guided his truck through the nearly empty parking lot. Sleep had evaded him after leaving the hospital, his mind too full of tsunami warnings and government agents with cold eyes. He'd spent the night on his boat instead, reviewing coastal evacuation maps and tide charts, preparing for what might come. As promised, he returned to the hospital at first light, a bag of clothes borrowed from his neighbor's daughter in hand. What he found was chaos. Nurses rushing through corridors, security guards stationed at entrances, and Emily Winters nowhere to be found in room 217. She checked herself out against medical advice, the charge nurse told him, disapproval clear in her voice. Took that big dog of hers too. Left about an hour ago. Frank wasn't entirely surprised. Emily struck him as the type who wouldn't wait for permission when lives were at stake. But where would she go? The Institute seemed most likely. She needed those computers to run her models. Frank turned to leave, then paused. Did she say anything before she left? Leave a message, maybe? The nurse hesitated, then sighed. Nothing official. But she did ask if I knew where the second wind was docked. She gave him a knowing look. That's your boat, isn't it? Frank nodded, gratitude and determination mingling as he hurried back to the harbor. Sure enough, as he approached the dock, he spotted a figure sitting on a bench near his slip. Emily, with Rex lying at her feet. She wore hospital scrubs under a borrowed jacket that hung loose on her still too thin frame. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a hasty ponytail, dark circles under her eyes betraying her exhaustion despite the determined set of her jaw. Figured you'd come here, she said as he approached. Hope you don't mind. Been expecting you, Frank replied, noting how she still leaned on Rex for support as she stood. Though I also figured you'd be smart enough to stay in the hospital at least until daylight. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. Never been accused of patience. Besides, time is running out, I know. Frank gestured toward his truck. You're wanting to get to the Institute, I reckon. Emily nodded, but hesitation flickered across her features. They'll be watching it. Homeland Security. Probably James, too. My key card might not even work anymore. Then we need a plan, Frank said simply. But first, breakfast. Can't save the coast on an empty stomach. 20 minutes later, they sat in a corner booth of the whaling station, a dockside diner that had been serving fishermen since before Frank was born. The owner, Maggie, had known Frank for decades, and didn't bat an eye at Rex settling under their table, merely bringing an extra bowl of water without being asked. Over plates of eggs and coffee, strong enough to float a spoon, Emily laid out what they faced. The full data set needs to be run through our tsunami prediction models, specialized software that only exists on the Institute's main server. Without official results from those models, no one will issue an evacuation order. And your colleague, this James fella, he's trying to bury your findings? Emily pushed her eggs around her plate. James has been compromised. Pacific Coastal Development is investing heavily in his new research division. A tsunami warning would kill their Carmel project before it breaks ground. She looked up, her expression haunted. I never thought he'd go this far. We were friends, colleagues. I trusted him. Frank recognized the pain of betrayal in her eyes. He'd seen it in his own mirror the day his first mate had sold their catch to a different buyer, cutting Frank out of the profits they'd worked together to earn. The thing about betrayal, he said carefully, is it tells you more about them than it does about you. Your trust wasn't wrongly given. His betrayal was wrongly done. Emily studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly. Wise words from a fisherman. Old age has to come with some benefits, Frank replied with a slight smile. Now about getting into that institute. I have a contact, Emily said, lowering her voice. Megan Chen, security supervisor. She owes me a favor. I testified for her brother when he was facing charges for environmental activism last year. If I can reach her, she might help us get in through the service entrance. Frank nodded slowly. And once inside? The servers are in the basement level. I need 15 minutes, maybe 20, to run the complete data set through the models and generate the official prediction reports. With those, we can go directly to the Coast Guard. They have authority to initiate evacuations for tsunami threats, bypassing local officials. And how much time do we have left? Emily checked her watch. Just under 16 hours until the critical threshold, according to my calculations. Then let's not waste any more time, Frank said, signaling for the check. As they drove toward the Monterey Oceanographic Institute, Frank found himself thinking about the last time he'd been involved in something bigger than his daily routine. It had been nearly 20 years ago, during the Point Reyes fire, when he'd used his boat to evacuate families cut off by the rapidly spreading flames. He remembered the weight of responsibility, the fear of failure, but also the clarity of purpose that came with knowing exactly what needed to be done. "Penny for your thoughts," Emily said, breaking the silence. Frank kept his eyes on the road. "Just remembering another time when things went sideways made me think of something my father used to say. Son, when the tide turns against you, don't waste energy fighting it. Find the current that's flowing your way and use it." "Sound advice for oceanography, too," Emily replied. "The question is, what current can we use right now?" "Your data," Frank said simply. "Truth has its own current. We just need to help it along." As they approached the Institute, an impressive glass and steel structure overlooking the bay, Emily directed him to a small parking lot behind the main building. "Service entrance is there. Let me call Megan." The call was brief, tense. When Emily hung up, her expression was grim. "Homeland Security has stationed agents at all entrances. They're specifically looking for me. Megan can get us in through the loading dock, but we'll have to be quick. She can only disable the cameras for a few minutes before someone notices." Frank parked in the shadow of a delivery truck, studying the building. "What about your dog? He'll be pretty conspicuous." Emily scratched Rex behind the ears, conflict clear in her eyes. "He'll have to stay in the truck. Rex, guard," she commanded firmly. The German shepherd's posture changed immediately, alert and focused. "He'll stay until we return." They timed their approach carefully, waiting until Megan's text confirmed the loading dock was clear. Moving quickly despite Emily's still weakened condition, they slipped inside, following service corridors rarely seen by the Institute's visitors or most of its staff. "Server room is 2 floors down," Emily whispered as they waited for an elevator. "Megan's badge will get us in, but my credentials should still work on the systems themselves." The elevator arrived with a soft ping that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet corridor. As the doors closed behind them, Frank noticed Emily's hands trembling slightly. "You holding up okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded, but her pallor concerned him. "Just need to get this done." The basement level was eerily silent, the hum of advanced climate control systems the only sound as they made their way down a corridor lined with doors marked with technical designations. Emily stopped before one labeled "Primary Server, Authorized Personnel Only," and swiped Megan's badge. The lock clicked open. "We're in," she breathed, relief evident in her voice. "Now I just need—" "Emily?" The male voice from behind them made them both freeze. Frank turned slowly to see a tall man with salt and pepper hair standing at the end of the corridor, genuine shock on his face. "James," Emily acknowledged, her voice suddenly cold. James Parker recovered quickly, his initial surprise replaced by careful neutrality. "You're supposed to be in the hospital. Everyone's been worried sick." "I doubt that," Emily replied, "especially you." A flash of something Guilt? Anger? Crossed James's face. You don't understand the situation, Emily. These wild predictions of yours, the economic impact alone. Wild predictions? Emily's voice rose slightly. You've seen the data, James. You know what it means. James glanced at Frank, then back to Emily. Who's this? Emily, you can't bring unauthorized personnel into secure areas. The board will have your credentials permanently revoked. This is Frank Wilson, Emily said. He saved my life after the Oceanic Explorer went down. After you sabotaged the equipment to discredit my research. James's expression hardened. That's a serious accusation. The storm was unexpected, tragic. Captain Brooks reported concerns about equipment modifications, but that's being investigated properly. By the same people who conveniently took my data drives into custody, Emily challenged. How long did it take you to reach the Institute after your rescue, James? Long enough to modify the baseline data in the system? Frank watched the exchange silently, assessing. James Parker was smooth, controlled, a man accustomed to navigating both scientific and political waters. But there was something in his eyes when Emily mentioned the modified equipment, a flicker of calculation rather than denial. Emily, James said, his tone softening to something almost paternal, you've been through a traumatic experience. Near drowning, exposure, it can affect judgment, create paranoia. Let me call Dr. Lawrence. You should be under medical supervision. He reached for his phone, but Frank stepped forward, placing himself between James and Emily. Seems to me, Frank said quietly, that the lady wants to run some data through those computers of yours. Shouldn't take long. Then everybody can see what's what. James eyed Frank with newfound wariness. This is an internal institute matter, Mr. Wilson. I appreciate your assistance in rescuing Dr. Winters, but this facility handles sensitive oceanographic data. I must insist you both leave before I'm forced to call security. Emily moved toward the server room door. I'm running the models, James, with the original data from my drives. If I'm wrong, I'll resign from the Institute. But if I'm right, you'll cause a panic for nothing, James snapped, his composure finally cracking. Do you have any idea what an evacuation order would do? The Carmel project alone would lose millions in financing. The Institute's reputation would suffer more if we ignored a legitimate threat and people died, Emily finished. Is that really the choice you want to make? Money over lives? Something shifted in James's expression. A calculation, a decision. You don't have your data drives. They're in custody. Emily smiled thinly. I always keep backups, James. You know that. She pulled a small waterproof case from her pocket, one Frank recognized from her emergency pack. James's face paled slightly. That doesn't change anything, he said, reaching for his phone again. Security will be here in minutes. Frank had spent enough time watching men negotiate on fishing docks to recognize when someone was bluffing. Son, he said, using the term deliberately despite James being only a decade or so his junior, seems to me you're out of cards to play. Why not let the lady run her numbers? If she's wrong, you can say you were humoring her. If she's right, you both look like heroes. For a long moment, James seemed to waver. Then, with obvious reluctance, he nodded. 15 minutes, that's all. Then security comes, regardless of what your models show. Emily didn't waste a second, disappearing into the server room with James following close behind. Frank took up position by the door, watching the corridor while listening to the rapid-fire technical exchange inside as Emily loaded her data and initialized the prediction models. His thoughts drifted to Martha. She'd always said he had a knack for finding trouble, a talent for inserting himself into situations most sensible people would avoid. Your heart's too big for your own good, Frank Wilson, she'd tell him, half exasperated, half proud. What would she make of this? Her husband of 40 years, involved in a potential tsunami warning, standing guard in a scientific institute's basement? She'd laugh, he decided, Then she'd roll up her sleeves and ask how she could help. The minutes ticked by, tension building. From inside the server room, Frank could hear the clatter of keyboards, Emily's voice rising and falling as she navigated the complex systems. James's responses became increasingly terse, his initial skepticism giving way to what sounded like reluctant concern. Finally, after what seemed an eternity but was likely only 12 minutes, Emily emerged, her face pale but triumphant, clutching several printed pages. "The models confirm it," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "A tsunami formation is imminent, wave height projected between 15 and 20 feet, arrival time approximately 11 hours from now. That's official Institute prediction, run through verified models, with complete data set." James followed her out, his expression unreadable. "I've authenticated the results," he said stiffly. "They'll be automatically transmitted to the National Tsunami Warning Center." Emily stared at him. "You believe me now?" "The data is compelling," James admitted. "But you have to understand, the economic impact will be significantly less than the impact of 15-foot waves hitting an unprepared coastline," Emily interrupted. "We need to move, now. The evacuation order needs to come as soon as possible to give people time to reach higher ground." As they hurried back toward the elevator, Frank felt the weight of the situation settle fully onto his shoulders. Thousands of lives potentially hanging in the balance, hours ticking away, and so much left to do. "What's next?" he asked as the elevator doors closed behind them. Emily clutched the printouts like a lifeline. "Coast Guard. They can initiate the emergency broadcast system and start the evacuation protocol." James, who had followed them into the elevator, shook his head. "They'll want verification from the National Warning Center first. That could take hours." "Hours we don't have," Emily replied grimly. As the elevator doors opened to the main floor, they were met by two men in dark suits, Agent Dawson and his colleague from the hospital. "Dr. Winters," Dawson said, his tone neutral but his posture blocking their path. "I believe we had an appointment scheduled for this morning at the hospital." Emily straightened, holding out the printouts. "Agent Dawson, we have official confirmation of an imminent tsunami threat. Wave height 15 to 20 feet, arrival in approximately 11 hours. The Institute's models have verified my findings." Dawson's expression didn't change as he accepted the papers. "We'll review these immediately. In the meantime, I need you to come with us for debriefing regarding the Oceanic Explorer incident." "There's no time for that," Emily protested. "The evacuation order needs to be issued immediately." "Standard protocols will be followed, Dr. Winters," Dawson replied smoothly. "The National Tsunami Warning Center will make the determination based on all available data, not just your models." Frank stepped forward. "Son, I've been on these waters for 40 years. Never seen anything like what's happening. If the lady says there's danger coming, I'd listen." Dawson's cold eyes flicked to Frank, then back to Emily. "Mr. Wilson, your assistance in the rescue is appreciated, but this is now a matter of national security. Please return to your vessel and await further instructions." Before Frank could respond, the Institute's front doors burst open and Rex bounded in, barking urgently. Security guards moved to intercept the dog, but Rex easily evaded them, racing straight to Emily's side. "How did he—" Frank began. "The truck windows," Emily realized. "I left one cracked for air. He must have squeezed through." Rex continued barking, his entire body tense with urgency. Emily knelt beside him, checking his collar, then gasped, "Frank, look at this!" Embedded in Rex's collar was a small device Frank hadn't noticed before, a compact emergency beacon, its light flashing red. "It's from the Oceanic Explorer," Emily explained quickly. "Maritime Emergency Protocol. They activate automatically when they detect prolonged immersion in salt water followed by significant barometric pressure changes." Her eyes widened. It's detecting the atmospheric pressure drop that precedes a tsunami. She looked up at Agent Dawson, triumph and fear mingling in her expression. There's your independent verification. The emergency beacon is detecting the same conditions my models predicted. Dawson studied the beacon, then the printouts, his professional mask finally showing cracks of concern. After a moment, he pulled out his phone and stepped aside, speaking rapidly in low tones. James Parker approached Emily, his expression conflicted. If this is happening as rapidly as the models suggest, the standard warning systems may not be sufficient. Many coastal residents ignore evacuation orders until they see physical evidence. We need to convince people this is real, Emily agreed. Not just an exercise or a false alarm. Frank watched the government agents huddled in urgent conversation, the scientists debating technical details, and felt the weight of practical experience that had guided him through countless storms at sea. Sometimes the most direct approach was best. "Seems to me," he said, drawing their attention, "that people around here know their boats and their fishermen. If every vessel in the harbor starts heading for deeper water, folks will notice. If every fisherman calls their family and tells them to head for high ground, word will spread." Emily's eyes lit up. A grassroots evacuation alongside the official channels. Exactly, Frank nodded. Official warnings are good, but nothing gets people moving like seeing their neighbors packing up. Agent Dawson returned, his demeanor notably changed. The National Warning Center is reviewing the data now. In the meantime, I've been authorized to initiate preliminary evacuation procedures for the immediate coastal areas. That's not enough, Emily insisted. The entire coastline from Monterey to Santa Cruz needs to evacuate, at least 3 miles inland or to elevations above 60 feet. "One step at a time, Dr. Winters," Dawson replied, but his tone lacked its earlier dismissiveness. "I need you to come with us to the Emergency Operations Center. Your expertise will be valuable as we coordinate the response." Emily looked at Frank, indecision clear in her face. "I should go with them. Make sure they understand the full scope." Frank nodded. "You go. I'll handle the harbor. Get the word out to every boat owner and fisherman I know." "I'll help," James offered unexpectedly. "I have contacts at all the coastal research stations. They can spread the word through their networks." Emily studied her colleague for a moment, then nodded cautiously. "Thank you, James." As they prepared to part ways, each to their urgent tasks, Emily suddenly turned and embraced Frank, the gesture catching him by surprise. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing me when no one else would." Frank awkwardly patted her back, unaccustomed to such displays after years of solitude. "Just doing what needed doing. You and Rex take care now." As Emily departed with the government agents, Rex at her side, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that their story together wasn't finished, not by a long shot. With renewed purpose, he headed for the harbor, mind already racing with the names of every boat captain and fisherman he needed to warn. The clock was ticking. The ocean was stirring. And Frank Wilson, for the first time in years, was exactly where he needed to be. Monterey Harbor buzzed with unusual activity as Frank moved from dock to dock, spreading word of the impending danger. The morning sun now hung fully above the horizon, its warm light creating a deceptive tranquility across the gentle waters, waters that Frank now eyed with newfound wariness. "You're sure about this, Frank?" asked Hank Dawson, a crab fisherman whose family had worked these waters for 3 generations. "Ain't never heard of no tsunami warning without an earthquake first." "It's different this time," Frank explained, his voice carrying the weight of urgency without panic. "Thermal activity underwater. Got a scientist from the Institute with data proving it's coming. Wave height 15 to 20 feet, hitting sometime tonight." Hank whistled low. "That'd wipe out half the waterfront." "Exactly why we need to get everyone moving. You still got that old CB radio network with the boys down in Moss Landing? Sure do. Get on it. Tell them to move their boats to deeper water and get their families to higher ground. Frank clasped the younger man's shoulder. This ain't a drill, Hank. As Hank hurried off to spread the word, Frank continued his methodical march down the docks. Some captains scoffed, others took him seriously immediately, his reputation for level-headedness earning him the benefit of doubt. By mid-morning, a steady stream of boats was heading out to open water, an unusual exodus that caught the attention of tourists and locals alike. Frank had just finished convincing the harbor master to sound the emergency horn pattern when his phone rang. Emily. Frank, where are you? Her voice was tight with tension. Harbor. Getting boats to safety. How's it going with the officials? Mixed. The National Warning Center has issued an advisory, but not a full warning yet. They're still verifying with buoy data. The frustration in her voice was palpable. We need you at the Emergency Operations Center. You have credibility with the local fishing community that could help convince the mayor to order a full evacuation. On my way, Frank replied, already heading toward his truck. What's the address? Emily gave him directions to a nondescript government building inland. As Frank drove, he noted with concern how normal everything appeared. Tourists shopping, locals going about their business, beaches still populated with sunbathers. Only the unusual number of boats heading out to sea and an increased police presence hinted at the danger looming offshore. The Emergency Operations Center was a hive of controlled chaos when Frank arrived. Large screens displayed maps of the coastline, weather patterns, and ocean current data. Officials in various uniforms huddled around tables, debating strategies with increasingly heated gestures. Emily spotted him immediately, relief washing over her tired face. Rex lay at her feet, alert despite the commotion. She beckoned Frank over to where she stood with Agent Dawson and a distinguished older man in a suit who Frank recognized as Mayor Robert Henderson. Frank, thank you for coming, Emily said. This is Mayor Henderson. Mayor, this is Frank Wilson, the fisherman who rescued me. The mayor shook Frank's hand firmly. Mr. Wilson, Dr. Winters speaks highly of your experience on these waters. 43 years commercial fishing this coast, Frank confirmed. Never seen anything like what's brewing out there now. Mayor Henderson's expression remained skeptical. That's just it, Mr. Wilson. We can't actually see anything yet. The National Weather Service has only issued an advisory, not a warning. Ordering a full evacuation of Monterey without concrete evidence would be unprecedented. By the time you have concrete evidence, it'll be too late, Frank replied bluntly. Ocean doesn't send engraved invitations before it tries to kill you. Agent Dawson stepped forward. Mayor, we're receiving conflicting assessments. No AA buoys are showing anomalies, but not at the levels Dr. Winters' models predict. Because the buoys aren't positioned over the thermal vent, Emily interjected, frustration coloring her voice. They're measuring secondary effects only. The models account for that. The mayor rubbed his forehead. Do you understand what you're asking? Evacuating the entire Monterey Peninsula would cost millions, disrupt thousands of lives. If nothing happens, and if something does happen and you didn't act, Frank countered quietly. A tense silence followed, broken by the arrival of a Coast Guard officer who handed Agent Dawson a printout. Dawson scanned it quickly, his expression growing grave. No AA ship. Davidson just reported unusual wave patterns 70 miles offshore. Consistent with preliminary tsunami formation, the mayor's face paled. How long? 8 hours, maybe less, Emily answered. We need to start the evacuation now. Mayor Henderson looked around the room at the assembled experts, then back to Frank. Mr. Wilson, you know the local community. If I issue this order, will people comply, or will they think it's an overreaction? Frank considered the question carefully. Some will drag their feet, always do. But I've got most of the harbor captains convinced already. Fishermen know when something's not right with the water. They'll help spread the word. The mayor nodded once. Decision made. Initiate the evacuation protocol. All zones within 3 miles of the coastline. Priority to low-lying areas. He turned to his staff. I want emergency services, police, and fire going door to door. Emergency broadcast system, social media, everything we've got. As the room erupted into coordinated activity, Emily touched Frank's arm. Thank you, she said quietly. We still have a lot to do, but that was the biggest hurdle. Frank nodded, studying the wall-mounted clock. What can I do next? The evacuation will take hours, Emily said. And there's something else we need to consider. She lowered her voice. The Institute has a research station right on the water. Specialized equipment, irreplaceable marine specimens. The evacuation order covers personnel, but someone needs to secure what can be saved. And you're thinking that someone is you, Frank guessed, noting the determined set of her jaw. I know the priority systems, what to shut down, what to move. James would normally handle it, but he's coordinating with other research stations up the coast. Frank frowned. You're still recovering from nearly drowning. Should be resting, not running into danger. Emily's tired smile held surprising warmth. Sounds like something my father would say. But this is my responsibility, Frank. Those specimens represent years of research that could be lost forever. Frank recognized the look in her eyes, the same stubborn determination he'd seen in Rex when the dog refused to leave Emily's side. All right, he conceded, but you're not going alone. Rex and I are coming with you. Emily started to protest, then nodded. Thank you. We should hurry. They informed Agent Dawson of their plan, who reluctantly approved it after Emily insisted the research materials were vital to national interests. The streets of Monterey were already showing signs of the evacuation order. Increased traffic heading inland, police directing vehicles, emergency vehicles with sirens blaring. The Institute, when they arrived, was largely deserted, emergency lights casting an eerie glow through the normally bustling building. Emily led them directly to the lower levels where specialized tanks housed rare marine specimens. These need to be transferred to the portable life support units, she explained, gesturing to a row of cylindrical containers. They maintain temperature and oxygenation for up to 72 hours. We need to move as many as we can to the transport vehicle in the loading bay. Frank rolled up his sleeves. Just tell me what to do. For the next hour, they worked methodically, transferring delicate sea creatures and vital research materials to the specialized transport containers. Frank's strong hands proved steady and gentle with the fragile specimens, following Emily's instructions precisely. Rex patrolled the perimeter, occasionally returning to check on their progress. As they worked, Frank found himself studying Emily with newfound respect. Despite her obvious exhaustion and recent trauma, she moved with purpose and precision, her knowledge of the complex systems impressive. In the focused intensity of her work, Frank caught glimpses of the dedicated scientist who had earned such loyalty from her remarkable dog. Almost done, Emily announced, securing the last container. Just need to power down the main systems, and a deep rumble interrupted her, the floor beneath them trembling slightly. Equipment rattled on shelves, and the water in the remaining tanks sloshed against their sides. Rex barked once, sharply. What was that? Frank asked, steadying himself against a table. Preliminary seismic activity, Emily said, her voice tight. It's starting. The seafloor displacement is beginning. How much time does that give us? Less than we thought. Maybe 5 hours, not 8. She moved quickly to the main control panel, fingers flying over the keyboard as she initiated shutdown sequences. We need to get these specimens to higher ground immediately. The building shuddered again, more violently this time. An alarm began to sound, its high-pitched wail echoing through the empty corridors. "That's the Institute's tsunami warning system," Emily explained, working faster. "It's linked directly to the NOAA buoys. They must be detecting significant wave formation now." Frank felt the familiar calm that had seen him through countless dangerous situations at sea settle over him. "I'll start loading the transport. You finish here and meet me at the loading dock in 5 minutes." Emily nodded, focused on the shutdown procedures. Frank began moving the specimen containers onto wheeled carts, Rex helping by pulling a specially designed harness attached to one of the lighter units. They had nearly finished loading when a third, stronger tremor rocked the building. The lights flickered, then went out completely, emergency generators humming to life seconds later. A crash from the laboratory sent Frank running back inside. He found Emily pinned beneath a fallen storage cabinet, struggling to push it off. "Emily!" he called, rushing to her side. "Don't move!" The cabinet was heavy, but adrenaline surged through Frank's aging muscles as he lifted it enough for Emily to slide free. She winced as she tried to stand, favoring her right leg. "I think it's just bruised," she said, though her pale face suggested otherwise. "We need to finish loading." "Almost done," Frank assured her, supporting her weight as they made their way back to the loading dock. "Just a few more containers." They worked quickly, despite Emily's injury, securing the last of the specimens in the Institute's heavy-duty research van. As Frank helped Emily into the passenger seat, Rex jumped in to sit at her feet, his protective instincts clearly on high alert. "Where to?" Frank asked, sliding behind the wheel. "The secondary research facility in Salinas Valley," Emily directed. "It's well above sea level, about 20 miles inland." As they pulled away from the Institute, Frank could see the evacuation in full swing, streets clogged with vehicles heading inland, emergency personnel directing traffic, people carrying hastily packed belongings. The coastal highway would be gridlocked soon. "We need to take back roads," he decided, turning onto a less-traveled street that wound up into the hills behind Monterey. "I know these roads from fishing trips up to the mountain lakes." Emily nodded gratefully, her face tight with pain as she adjusted her position. "Good thinking." They had just cleared the main part of town when Emily's phone rang. It was Agent Dawson. "Dr. Winters, where are you?" His voice was tense, audible to Frank over the speaker. "Heading to the Salinas facility with the critical specimens," she replied. "What's happening?" "The situation has accelerated. NOAA buoys are detecting wave formation much sooner than predicted. We've upgraded to a full tsunami warning for the entire Central California coast. First waves estimated to hit in under 3 hours." Emily's eyes met Frank's, shock evident in both their faces. 3 hours? That's not possible. The models showed— "Your models were right about formation, wrong about timing," Dawson cut in. "Get to higher ground immediately and stay there. We're shifting to emergency protocols now." The call ended, leaving a heavy silence in the van as Frank pressed harder on the accelerator, taking the winding road at speeds that would normally make him uncomfortable. 3 hours, Emily whispered. "We underestimated the acceleration rate of the thermal expansion." Frank glanced in the rearview mirror, the coastal town falling away below them. "Will the evacuation be complete in time?" "I don't know," Emily admitted, her scientific certainty giving way to very human worry. The full evacuation plan was designed for a 5 to 8 hour window. They crested a hill that offered a panoramic view of Monterey Bay. From this elevation, Frank could see the unusual choppiness of the water, the strange patterns forming offshore that most casual observers would miss, but that sent chills down his spine. In his decades at sea, he'd learned to read the water like others read books, and what he saw now spoke of danger. "Look," he said, pointing. "The water's already pulling back from some of the beaches." Emily leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. "Initial drawback. It's starting already." The road ahead forked, one path continuing up into the hills, the other descending slightly toward the highway that would take them to Salinas. Frank hesitated at the junction. The specimens, how critical are they really? Emily understood the question immediately. You're thinking we should go back? Help with the evacuation? Those are my people down there, Frank said simply. Folks who might not take a government warning seriously but would listen to me. Emily studied him for a long moment, then nodded decisively. The specimens are important but not worth lives, and they're safe now as long as we keep moving to higher ground. She pointed to the uphill road. That eventually connects with the fire access road that runs along the ridge, doesn't it? All the way from Carmel to Monterey, Frank confirmed. Used it during deer season for years. Then we can follow it back toward town, stay at elevation, and still help warn people in the outlying areas that might be missed in the official evacuation. Frank turned onto the uphill road without further hesitation. Exactly what I was thinking. As they climbed higher, the view of the coastline expanded. From their elevated position, they could see the emergency vehicles with flashing lights, hear distant sirens, and observe the streams of cars heading inland. But they could also see isolated properties tucked into coastal inlets, small communities that might be overlooked in the larger evacuation effort. There, Emily pointed to a cluster of houses set back in a small cove. That's Fisher's Landing. Mostly vacation rentals, but some year-round residents. Narrow access road that's easy to miss. Frank nodded grimly. And directly in the path of where those waves will hit hardest. Without needing to discuss further, he turned the van onto the fire road that would take them there. As they navigated the rough terrain, Rex stood alert between them, sensing their urgency and scanning the passing landscape with the focus that had made his breed legendary as working dogs. The weight of responsibility settled firmly on Frank's shoulders, a familiar burden from his days as a boat captain when other lives depended on his judgment. But this time, the stakes were higher than they'd ever been. His decision to turn back might mean the difference between life and death for people who had no idea of the danger rushing toward shore. And as the minutes ticked away, Frank couldn't help but wonder if they would reach them in time, or if the sea would claim yet more lives despite all their efforts to prevent tragedy. The road ahead twisted down toward Fisher's Landing, and Frank pressed the accelerator harder, acutely aware that somewhere out in the Pacific, the ocean was gathering itself into a wall of water that would show no mercy when it finally reached the shore. Time was running out. The narrow access road to Fisher's Landing wound precariously down the coastal hillside, forcing Frank to navigate the Institute's van with painstaking care despite their urgency. Rounding the final bend, the small community came into view. A cluster of about 20 homes nestled in a picturesque cove, most perched on stilts to accommodate the high tide line. The scene appeared deceptively peaceful. Children playing on the small private beach, residents tending gardens, a few boats bobbing gently at the community's private dock. No evacuation here, Emily observed grimly, scanning for any sign of emergency personnel. They have no idea what's coming. Frank pulled into the central parking area and honked the horn repeatedly, drawing curious and annoyed looks from nearby residents. A middle-aged man in a faded captain's hat approached, frowning. "Something wrong, folks?" "This is private property." Frank stepped out, projecting the authoritative calm that had served him well during ocean emergencies. "Name's Frank Wilson. I captained the second wind out of Monterey Harbor. There's a tsunami warning in effect. First waves expected to hit in less than 3 hours. Everyone needs to evacuate immediately." The man's frown deepened. "Tsunami? Haven't heard anything about that. TV and internet are working fine." Emily joined them, Rex at her side. "I'm Dr. Emily Winters from the Monterey Oceanographic Institute. The warning was just issued. This entire area will be underwater when the waves hit." Skepticism was written clearly across the man's weathered face. "No offense, but we get all kinds of warnings around here. most turn out to be nothing. Frank understood the resistance. He'd seen it countless times during storm warnings when fishermen calculated the risk against losing a day's catch. But there was no time for gradual persuasion. "Look at the water," he said firmly, pointing toward the cove. "Notice anything strange?" The man turned reluctantly. The tide was visibly receding at an unnatural rate, exposing sections of seafloor rarely seen. Offshore, the water's surface showed unusual ripple patterns. "That ain't normal," the man admitted, uncertainty replacing skepticism. "It's the first sign," Emily explained. "The water withdraws before the waves come. When it returns, it will be a wall 15 to 20 feet high. These houses won't survive." The gravity of the situation finally registered on the man's face. "Jesus, my name's Bill Cooper. I'm the Neighborhood Association president. We've got about 50 people here today, including kids and some elderly residents." "Is there a community alert system?" Emily asked. "Just a bell by the meeting house," Bill replied, already moving toward it. "Used for community meetings and emergencies." As Bill rang the bell with urgent persistence, Frank turned to Emily. "I'll start going door to door on this side. You take the other half if you're up to it." Emily nodded, though Frank noticed her wince as she put weight on her injured leg. "I'm fine. Rex, come." The German shepherd followed Emily closely as they separated, each beginning the urgent task of warning residents. Many responded with initial disbelief, but the rapidly receding tide provided visible evidence that convinced even the most skeptical. Within 20 minutes, the small community had transformed into a hive of activity, cars being packed, valuables gathered, residents helping elderly neighbors. Frank had just finished ensuring an older couple had their medications when Emily's voice called urgently from the beach area. "Frank, we need help!" He rushed toward her voice, finding Emily with a distraught woman near the now exposed dock. The water had receded nearly 100 yards, leaving boats stranded on the wet sand. "Her son took their rowboat out about an hour ago," Emily explained rapidly. "He's 12. Went to check his crab traps in the cove. He hasn't returned." The mother's face was pale with fear. "Tommy knows these waters, but he's never seen anything like this. If he's caught out there when the waves come—" Frank scanned the exposed cove, seeing no sign of a rowboat or boy. But further out, near the mouth of the cove where the water remained, he spotted something, a small boat struggling against unusual currents. "There," he pointed. "That him in the green boat?" "Yes!" the mother cried. "That's Tommy!" Frank assessed the situation quickly. The boy was fighting to row against currents that were behaving erratically as the ocean continued its ominous withdrawal. He was making little progress toward shore, and worse, seemed to be getting pulled further out with each passing minute. "Got a motorboat in the community?" Frank asked Bill, who had joined them. "Just jet skis, but they're locked in the storage shed and Walt has the key. He evacuated already." "No time to look for keys," Frank decided, already stripping off his jacket. "I'm going in after him." "Frank, no," Emily protested. "The currents are too dangerous, and the first wave could arrive early." "Can't leave the boy out there," Frank replied simply. "I've swum through worse." Before anyone could argue further, Rex suddenly barked sharply and raced down the exposed sea floor toward a small fishing boat that had been left stranded by the receding tide. The German shepherd stopped at its side, barking insistently at Frank. "Smart dog," Frank muttered, immediately understanding. He turned to Bill. "Help me drag that boat to the waterline. It'll be faster than swimming." Bill, Frank, and 2 other men rushed to the stranded boat, a 14-foot aluminum skiff with an outboard motor. Together they dragged it across the wet sand toward the retreating waterline, a journey of nearly 100 yards over increasingly treacherous terrain of exposed rocks and seaweed. "Engine might not start after sitting dry," Bill warned as they finally reached the water. "Only one way to find out. Frank replied, tilting the motor down into the water and priming the fuel line. He pulled the starter cord, silently praying. The engine sputtered, died, then roared to life on the third attempt. "I'm coming with you," Emily said, already climbing into the boat despite her injured leg. Frank wanted to object, but recognized the determination in her eyes. More importantly, they were losing precious minutes. "Stay low in the boat. Rex, stay." But the German shepherd ignored the command, leaping gracefully into the skiff and taking position at the bow, eyes fixed on the struggling rowboat in the distance. "Guess he's coming too," Frank conceded, opening the throttle. The small boat bounced across the choppy water, fighting against currents that pulled strangely sideways rather than in their usual patterns. Frank navigated with the skill of decades at sea, compensating for the unnatural water movements as they approached the boy. Tommy's face, when they reached him, was a mixture of terror and relief. His arms trembled with exhaustion from fighting the currents, and his small rowboat was taking on water. "Hold on, son," Frank called, maneuvering carefully alongside. "We're going to get you out." Emily reached across the gap, helping the frightened boy transfer from his sinking craft to their boat. Rex moved protectively to Tommy's side as the boy collapsed in the bottom of the skiff, shivering despite the warm day. The water started acting weird," Tommy stammered, "pulling me out. I couldn't row against it." "You did good staying with your boat," Frank assured him, already turning their vessel toward shore. "We'll have you back with your mama in no time." But as Frank opened the throttle, a massive vibration shuddered through the small craft. The outboard motor coughed, sputtered, and went silent. "No, no, no," Frank muttered, frantically pulling the starter cord. Nothing happened. "Something's fouled the propeller." Emily was already looking over the side. "There's seaweed wrapped around it. The abnormal currents are pulling up debris from the seafloor." Frank quickly tilted the motor up, revealing a thick tangle of kelp thoroughly wrapped around the propeller. "Need to clear this. Won't take but a minute." But as he worked to free the fouled propeller, Emily's sharp intake of breath made him look up. What he saw chilled his blood despite decades of experience at sea. On the horizon, a dark line had appeared. Not the normal swell of waves, but a raised wall of water extending across the entire visible ocean. The first tsunami wave was approaching, and they were directly in its path with a disabled boat. "How long?" Frank asked tersely, working faster at the tangled kelp. 10 minutes, maybe less," Emily replied, her scientific training allowing her to calculate the approaching wave's speed. "We won't make it to shore before it hits." Tommy began to cry quietly, the reality of their situation sinking in. Rex pressed against the boy, offering silent comfort as Frank considered their dwindling options. "We can't outrun it, but we might ride over it if we can get the motor started and head directly into the wave," Frank said, his hands never stopping their work on the propeller. "It's our only chance." Emily helped Frank clear the last of the kelp, her slender fingers reaching places his larger hands couldn't access. Together, they lowered the motor back into the water, and Frank pulled the starter cord with desperate strength. The engine sputtered but failed to catch. "Again," Emily encouraged, steadying herself against the increasingly agitated water. Frank pulled again and again. On the fourth attempt, the motor roared to life, and Frank immediately turned the boat to face the approaching wave, now clearly visible as a massive wall of water, perhaps half a mile distant. "Hold on tight," he instructed, opening the throttle fully. "Tommy, get low in the boat. Emily, brace yourself and keep the boy secured." The small boat surged forward, climbing the increasingly steep swells that preceded the main wave. Frank kept his eyes fixed on the approaching wall of water, judging its height against his decades of experience. 20 feet at least, he estimated grimly. Their small craft would need perfect positioning and considerable luck to climb over rather than being swamped. When we hit the wave, lean forward, he shouted over the engine's roar and the growing thunder of moving water. Don't look back. Just lean forward and pray. The distance closed with terrifying speed. Frank could see the wave's crest beginning to curl, white foam appearing at its top. A tsunami wave approaching shore and beginning to break. Their small boat climbed the face, the outboard motor screaming as Frank pushed it beyond its limits. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they hung at an impossible angle, the bow pointing almost straight up as they climbed the near vertical face of water. The motor strained, threatening to stall. Then, with a final surge of power, they crested the top of the wave and plunged down its backside into the trough beyond. "We made it!" Tommy cried, looking back at the wave now rushing toward the shore they'd left behind. "Don't celebrate yet," Frank warned, already turning the boat to face the second wave that would inevitably follow. That's just the first one. From their position beyond the breaking wave, they had a horrifying view of the tsunami's impact on Fisher's Landing. The massive wall of water smashed into the small community with devastating force, lifting houses from their foundations and sweeping away everything in its path. The residents they'd warned had hopefully reached higher ground, but the community itself was being erased before their eyes. "Oh, God," Emily whispered, one arm around Tommy to shield him from the full view of the destruction. There was no time to process the horror as Frank spotted the second wave forming. Smaller than the first, but still deadly, it approached with the same inexorable power. Once again, Frank positioned their small craft to face it head-on. Once again, they climbed the watery mountain, and once again, they survived the crossing. But the ordeal had taken its toll on their vessel and its aging motor. As they descended from the second wave, the engine sputtered and died, refusing Frank's attempts to restart it. They were now adrift in a chaotic sea, with possibly more waves to come, and debris from the shattered community swirling in the turbulent water around them. "We need to get further out," Emily said, grabbing one of the oars from Tommy's abandoned rowboat that they'd managed to secure to their skiff. "Away from the braking zone." Frank nodded grimly, taking the other oar. Together they began to row, fighting against exhaustion and the confused currents. Rex moved to the bow, barking warnings when large pieces of debris approached, allowing them to navigate the floating hazards. For nearly an hour they fought to maintain their position, witnessing two more waves, smaller but still destructive, crash toward the already devastated shoreline. The sun beat down mercilessly, and their small supply of drinking water was quickly exhausted. Tommy, initially terrified into silence, gradually began to ask questions that Emily answered with gentle honesty, the scientific explanation seeming to calm the boy's fears by making the disaster comprehensible. Frank focused on keeping them safe, constantly scanning for dangers and opportunities, conserving his strength for when it would be needed most. As the afternoon wore on, the sea gradually began to calm. The last wave had passed nearly 2 hours ago, and while the currents remained unpredictable, the immediate danger appeared to have subsided. "Look," Emily said suddenly, pointing toward the horizon. "Coast Guard." A helicopter was visible in the distance, sweeping back and forth along the coastline. Frank reached for the emergency flare he'd found in the boat's small storage compartment, waiting until the helicopter turned in their general direction before firing it into the sky. The bright red flare arced high above them, and moments later the helicopter changed course, heading directly toward their position. "They've seen us," Frank confirmed, allowing himself the first real hope since the motor had failed. The Coast Guard helicopter hovered above them, its rotor wash whipping the sea into froth. A rescue diver was lowered, quickly assessing the situation before attaching Tommy to the rescue harness. The boy was raised to safety, followed by Emily, who insisted that Rex be taken up with her, refusing to be separated from the dog who had twice been instrumental in saving lives. As Frank watched them ascend, a strange mix of emotions washed over him. Relief, certainly, but also a deeper feeling he hadn't experienced in years, the profound satisfaction of having made a difference when it mattered most. They had warned the community in time for most residents to escape. They had rescued Tommy. They had survived the waves themselves. When the harness descended for him, Frank took one last look at the small boat that had carried them through the tsunami. It had served its purpose, and now would join countless other vessels claimed by the sea over centuries. The sensation of being lifted above the water was disorienting after so many hours at sea level. As he rose, Frank could see the full extent of the tsunami's impact. Miles of coastline transformed, buildings destroyed, boats thrown inland like toys. The destructive power of the ocean, which he had respected all his life, was displayed in its full, terrible majesty. Inside the helicopter, he found Emily, Rex, and Tommy seated securely, emergency blankets wrapped around their shoulders. Emily reached out to squeeze his hand as he settled beside them, no words necessary between people who had faced death together and emerged on the other side. "Mr. Wilson?" the Coast Guard officer shouted over the rotor noise. "Agent Dawson requested you be brought directly to the Emergency Operations Center once found. Said you and Dr. Winters are the reason the casualty count isn't much higher." Frank nodded acknowledgement, too exhausted for conversation. As the helicopter banked toward Monterey, he allowed himself to close his eyes briefly. The day's events replayed in his mind. The dog swimming desperately in the open ocean, the rescue of Emily, the warnings that had initially fallen on deaf ears, the tsunami itself. A wet nose nudged his hand, and Frank opened his eyes to find Rex watching him with what seemed like understanding in those intelligent eyes. The German shepherd had demonstrated courage and loyalty beyond what Frank had thought possible for an animal. In the space of a few days, the dog had swum miles through open ocean to find help for his owner, then helped save a community and rescue a stranded boy. "You're something else, Rex," Frank murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Something else entirely." As the helicopter approached Monterey, Frank could see emergency vehicles with flashing lights covering the roads leading inland. The coastal areas looked battered but not completely destroyed. The evacuation had worked, at least partially. There would be damage to repair, lives to rebuild, but the worst-case scenario of thousands of casualties had been avoided. Frank felt Emily's eyes on him and turned to meet her gaze. Despite her exhaustion and the trauma of the past days, there was something new in her expression. A warmth and connection that transcended their shared ordeal. Something that, despite his long years of solitude, Frank recognized instantly. "We did it," she said simply. "You did it," Frank corrected. "You and Rex. I just tagged along for the ride." Emily shook her head. "No. We did it together. That's the only reason any of us are alive right now." As the helicopter descended toward a makeshift landing zone near the Emergency Operations Center, Frank realized with sudden clarity that his life had been irrevocably changed. The comfortable solitude he'd inhabited since Martha's death had been broken open, and in its place was something both frightening and exhilarating: new connections, new purpose, new possibilities. Whatever came next, Frank Wilson was no longer facing it alone. And as they touched down on solid ground, that knowledge felt unexpectedly like coming home after a very long voyage at sea. The Emergency Operations Center had transformed into a hub of recovery efforts by the time the Coast Guard helicopter delivered Frank, Emily, and Rex to its makeshift landing zone. Exhausted emergency workers moved with purposeful efficiency, their faces showing the strain of the past 24 hours. As they were escorted inside, Frank noticed the wall-mounted screens displaying aerial footage of the devastation along the coast, buildings reduced to rubble, boats tossed inland like children's toys, roads washed away by the relentless power of the waves. Agent Dawson met them at the entrance, his typically impassive expression softened by what might have been respect. "Dr. Winters, Mr. Wilson, glad to see you made it. We've been tracking the Coast Guard rescue operation." He glanced at Tommy, who remained close to Rex's side. "Your mother is here, son." "She's been worried sick." The reunion between Tommy and his mother brought tears to even the most stoic observers. The woman falling to her knees to embrace her son, her body shaking with sobs of relief. Rex watched the scene with attentive eyes, tail wagging gently when Tommy turned to introduce his mother to the amazing dog who helped save me. "The preliminary reports are coming in," Dawson informed them as a medic examined Emily's injured leg. 7 confirmed casualties along the Central Coast, all individuals who either didn't evacuate or were caught in vulnerable locations. Without the early warning. He left the sentence unfinished, the implication clear. "How bad is the damage?" Frank asked, accepting a cup of coffee from a Red Cross volunteer. "Extensive. Coastal infrastructure is severely compromised from Carmel to Santa Cruz. But the inland evacuation was largely successful, approximately 92% completion before the first wave hit." Dawson's gaze moved between Frank and Emily. "The grassroots warning system you implemented made a significant difference, especially in isolated communities like Fisher's Landing. Most residents made it to higher ground in time." Emily winced as the medic wrapped her leg. "What about the research specimens? Did the transport vehicle make it to the Salinas facility?" "Arrived safely," Dawson confirmed. "Dr. Parker personally ensured everything was properly secured once it arrived." At the mention of James Parker, Emily's expression hardened. "Has he been questioned about the equipment modifications on the Oceanic Explorer?" "He's cooperating fully with the investigation," Dawson replied diplomatically. "The focus right now is on recovery efforts, but I assure you, Dr. Winters, all aspects of this incident will be thoroughly examined." The mayor of Monterey appeared, looking haggard but composed. He approached Frank and Emily with extended hand. "Mr. Wilson, Dr. Winters, on behalf of our community, thank you. Your actions saved countless lives today." Before either could respond, the door burst open and a film crew entered, led by a reporter Frank recognized from local news broadcasts. The mayor intercepted them, attempting to establish some boundaries, but the reporter was insistent. "Dr. Winters, can we get a statement about the tsunami and your miraculous rescue at sea?" Emily glanced at Frank, uncertainty in her tired eyes. He nodded slightly. The public deserved to understand what had happened, and her scientific expertise could provide that understanding. With visible effort, Emily straightened and moved toward the cameras, Rex at her side. Frank stepped back, content to remain out of the spotlight. He'd never sought recognition for doing what needed to be done, whether at sea or on land. As Emily began explaining the thermal activity that had triggered the tsunami, Frank slipped outside for a moment of quiet. The evening air carried the scent of salt and debris, the aftermath of nature's fury. From the elevated position of the operations center, he could see portions of the altered coastline, the familiar contours of his beloved Monterey Bay reshaped by the day's events. Yet, as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the landscape, Frank felt an unexpected sense of peace. "Thought I might find you out here," came Emily's voice from behind him. She limped to his side, Rex following closely. "Not one for cameras, are you?" Frank shook his head. "Figure they got enough scientists and officials to explain things. Don't need an old fisherman cluttering up the picture." Emily studied him in the fading light. "You know, for someone who claims to prefer solitude, you have a remarkable talent for connecting with others when it matters most. The harbor captains listen to you. The residents at Fisher's Landing listen to you. Even Agent Dawson came around eventually." "Just speaking plain truth," Frank replied with a shrug. "Folks can sense when you're being straight with them. especially about danger. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the rescue helicopters continuing their sweep of the coastline as darkness approached. "What will you do now?" Emily finally asked. "Your boat?" "Second wind is fine," Frank said. "Had her moored in deeper water before the waves hit. Harbor master radioed that she rode it out without much damage." He hesitated, then added, "Though I reckon the cottage might be another story. Was pretty close to the water." Emily's hand found his, her fingers cool against his weathered skin. "You'll stay with me until you can assess the damage. I have plenty of room, and Rex would love the company." At the sound of his name, the German shepherd looked up, tail wagging, as if in agreement. Frank felt something shift inside him, a wall built over 3 lonely years developing its first significant crack. "Appreciate the offer, but I wouldn't want to impose." "After what we've been through together, there's no such thing as imposing," Emily replied firmly. "Besides, someone needs to keep an eye on this leg until it heals properly." Before Frank could respond, Agent Dawson approached with a satellite phone. "Dr. Winters, call for you. It's the National Oceanographic Survey Director." Emily squeezed Frank's hand once before taking the phone and moving a few steps away. From her animated gestures and increasingly wide smile, Frank gathered the news was positive. Rex moved closer to Frank, leaning against his leg in a gesture that felt surprisingly natural. "You're a special animal, you know that?" Frank murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Never seen anything like what you did out there." "He is exceptional," agreed a voice behind him. Frank turned to find James Parker standing awkwardly at the edge of the patio, hands shoved deep in his pockets. The scientist looked haggard, his typical polish replaced by a rumpled exhaustion. "Dr. Parker," Frank acknowledged coolly. "Mr. Wilson." James hesitated, then continued. "I wanted to thank you for what you did today, and to apologize." Frank studied the younger man carefully. "Not sure I'm the one needing your apology." "You're right." James glanced toward Emily, still engaged in her phone conversation. "I've made terrible mistakes. Let financial pressures and professional ambition cloud my judgment." He shook his head. "I never imagined it would lead to this." "Man makes his choices," Frank observed, neither accepting nor rejecting the apology. "Then lives with the consequences." "Indeed." James extended his hand tentatively. "For what it's worth, I'll be fully cooperating with the investigation, and I've already submitted my resignation from the Institute." After a moment's consideration, Frank shook the offered hand. Holding grudges had never been his way. The ocean had taught him that some forces were too powerful to resist, and the tide of consequences was one of them. James would face his reckoning without Frank adding to the weight. Emily returned, her expression brightening further at the sight of Frank with Rex. "That was Director Collins from NOAA," she announced. "They're establishing a permanent monitoring system for the thermal vent activity. And," she added with visible pride, "they've requested I lead the research team." "Congratulations," Frank said, genuinely pleased for her. "Sounds like important work." "It is." Emily's gaze shifted to James, her expression cooling but remaining professional. "James?" "Emily," he acknowledged with a nod. "I was just telling Mr. Wilson that I've submitted my resignation. The Institute deserves better leadership for its research division." A complex mix of emotions crossed Emily's face: vindication, sadness, perhaps even a touch of compassion for a fallen colleague. "The investigation will determine the full extent of what happened," she said finally. "In the meantime, the recovery efforts need all available expertise." James nodded, accepting the implicit instruction to make himself useful elsewhere. With a final nod to Frank, he departed, shoulders slightly bowed under the weight of his choices. "That couldn't have been easy," Frank observed once James was gone. "No," Emily admitted, "but necessary. Trust is fundamental in scientific collaboration, and once broken, she let the thought hang incomplete, then visibly shifted to a more positive subject. The director also mentioned something else. They're interested in establishing a civilian early warning network along the coast. Local captains and residents trained to recognize signs of unusual ocean activity. Frank raised an eyebrow. Sounds like a good idea. They asked if I knew someone with extensive local knowledge who might coordinate it. Someone the fishing community respects. Emily's eyes held a question. I thought of you immediately. The offer caught Frank by surprise. 3 days ago, his life had consisted of solitary fishing trips and quiet evenings in his coastal cottage, the monotony of grief having settled into a tolerable routine. Now, standing beside a woman of remarkable intelligence and courage, with an extraordinary dog who had quite literally changed the course of his life, Frank faced a future suddenly rich with possibility. I'd need to think about it, he said, though something in Emily's smile suggested she already knew his answer. Of course, she replied. No rush. They're still securing funding and developing the framework. She stepped closer, her voice softening. But I hope you'll consider it, Frank. You have a gift for this work, for seeing what others miss, for communicating urgency without causing panic. Those are rare qualities. As darkness fell completely over Monterey, emergency lights illuminated the operations center and the surrounding area. In the artificial brightness, Frank could see the fatigue etched deeply in Emily's face, despite her excitement about the future prospects. Time to get you somewhere you can rest properly, he decided. That leg needs elevation, and we could all use some real sleep. Emily didn't argue, her exhaustion finally catching up as the adrenaline of the day ebbed. Together they made arrangements with Agent Dawson to be transported to Emily's home in the Carmel Highlands, an area largely spared from the tsunami's impact due to its elevation. The drive through the damaged regions was sobering. National Guard checkpoints had been established, and cleanup crews were already at work clearing debris from main roads. Occasionally, they passed groups of displaced residents gathered around emergency shelters, their faces illuminated by floodlights as they sought information about homes and missing loved ones. Emily's house, when they finally arrived, was a modest but elegant structure set back from the road, surrounded by cypress trees and offering glimpses of the ocean between their twisted trunks. Inside, the simple furnishings reflected both practicality and comfort. Bookshelves overflowing with scientific texts, comfortable furniture arranged to take advantage of the views, and touches of natural elements throughout. Guest room is this way, Emily said, leading Frank down a hallway. Bathrooms across the hall. Make yourself at home. Rex trotted ahead, surprisingly familiar with the space as he nudged open the guest room door with his nose. Seems like Rex has appointed himself my guide, Frank observed with a smile. He's always had excellent judgment about people, Emily replied. From the moment he found you at sea, he knew you were someone special. The simple statement, delivered with quiet certainty, created a warmth in Frank's chest that had nothing to do with the comfortable temperature of the house. Reckon that goes both ways, he said. Never met a dog like him, or an owner like you for that matter. Emily's tired eyes crinkled with pleasure at the compliment. Get some rest, Frank. We can talk more tomorrow. But as Frank settled into the surprisingly comfortable guest bed that night, sleep proved elusive despite his bone-deep exhaustion. His mind kept returning to the events that had brought him to this point, a routine fishing trip transformed into a sequence of life-altering moments by the appearance of a dog swimming desperately in open water. Had it really been only 3 days? It seemed impossible that so much could change so quickly, yet here he was, in a stranger's home that somehow didn't feel strange at all, contemplating a future that looked nothing like the lonely existence he'd resigned himself to after Martha's death. A soft whine at the bedroom door interrupted his thoughts. When he opened it, Rex stood in the hallway, ears perked questioningly. can't sleep either, huh?" Frank whispered. The German shepherd padded into the room and settled on the rug beside the bed, apparently having appointed himself Frank's guardian for the night. The dog's presence was oddly comforting, a reminder that some connections formed in crisis could endure beyond it. Frank reached down to scratch behind Rex's ears. "You're a good boy," he murmured. "Best I've ever known." Rex's tail thumped against the floor in appreciation of both the words and the touch. Eventually, lulled by the rhythmic sound of the dog's breathing, Frank drifted into the deepest sleep he'd experienced in years. Morning brought sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the aroma of coffee brewing. Frank found Emily in the kitchen, her injured leg propped on a chair as she managed breakfast preparations one-handed. Rex sat attentively nearby, clearly hoping for a share of the eggs sizzling in the pan. "Should have woken me," Frank said, immediately moving to take over the cooking. "You need to stay off that leg." "I've managed worse with less help," Emily replied, though she relinquished the spatula without argument. "Coffee's fresh. Cups in the cabinet above." They ate breakfast on the deck overlooking the distant ocean, which appeared deceptively calm in the morning light. Only the unusual debris line visible along the shore revealed the previous day's violence. "Coast Guard called while you were sleeping," Emily informed him. "They've completed initial assessments of the harbor area. Most vessels moored in deeper water survived with minimal damage." "And the second wind?" "Some cosmetic damage to the starboard rail, but otherwise intact." "She's a sturdy boat." Frank nodded, relief evident in his expression. "And my cottage?" Emily's hesitation told him everything before she spoke. "I'm sorry, Frank. The entire row along Lighthouse Point was hit directly. There's not much left." He had expected as much, but the confirmation still landed heavily. That cottage had been home for 43 years, where he and Martha had raised their son, where they'd planned their retirement, where he'd mourned her passing. All those memories, photographs, mementos, gone. "Frank?" Emily's voice was gentle with concern. "It's just stuff," he said finally, though they both knew it was more than that. "Important thing is people survived." Emily reached across the table to cover his weathered hand with hers. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need. Permanently, if you'd like." The offer, made so simply, yet carrying such profound implications, momentarily robbed Frank of words. Before he could formulate a response, the doorbell rang. Emily rose with a slight wince. "That would be Agent Dawson. He mentioned stopping by this morning." Dawson was not alone. Accompanying him was a distinguished older man in a naval uniform adorned with the insignia of a rear admiral, along with Mayor Henderson and a camera crew that remained respectfully at the end of the driveway. "Dr. Winters, Mr. Wilson," Dawson greeted them. "Allow me to introduce Rear Admiral Peterson from the United States Coast Guard. He's here on official business." The admiral stepped forward, his bearing formal, but his expression warm. "Dr. Winters, Mr. Wilson, on behalf of the Coast Guard and the Department of Homeland Security, I'm here to personally thank you for your extraordinary service during yesterday's tsunami event." What followed was a brief but dignified ceremony on Emily's front lawn. Admiral Peterson presented each of them with the Coast Guard's Civilian Service Commendation, a rare honor for non-military personnel. Even Rex received special recognition in the form of a custom medal attached to his collar, acknowledging his remarkable role in the rescue operations. "The actions you took," Admiral Peterson concluded, "exemplify the highest traditions of courage and service to community. Your early warning efforts and subsequent rescue operations directly saved at least 47 lives, with hundreds more potentially saved through the accelerated evacuation." Frank accepted the commendation awkwardly, uncomfortable with formal recognition, but understanding its importance to those presenting it. Emily, standing beside him with Rex at her feet, handled the ceremony with natural grace despite her injured leg and visible fatigue. After the officials departed, taking the camera crew with them, a comfortable silence settled between them as they returned to the deck. The medals lay on the table between them, gleaming in the mid-morning sun. "Never expected anything like that," Frank admitted, eyeing the commendation with a mixture of pride and embarrassment. "You deserve it," Emily said simply. "All those people alive today because a fisherman decided to follow a dog into deeper water." Her expression grew thoughtful. "Life has such strange currents, doesn't it? Pulling us in unexpected directions." Frank nodded, thinking of his father's wisdom about finding the currents flowing your way. "Martha, my late wife, she used to say that the important turns in life rarely announce themselves. You just look back one day and realize the course changed when you weren't paying attention." "She sounds like a wise woman." "Wisest I ever knew," Frank agreed, a familiar ache softening into something more like fondness at the memory. "She'd have liked you and been absolutely smitten with Rex." The German shepherd, hearing his name, thumped his tail against the deck boards. Emily smiled, then grew serious. "About what I said earlier, about staying here. I meant it, Frank. These past days have shown me something I've been missing for a long time. A connection that goes beyond work or casual friendship." She hesitated, then continued with characteristic directness. "I'm not trying to replace Martha. No one could. But there's room in life for new chapters, isn't there?" Frank looked out at the ocean, its familiar expanse now forever changed in his perception. Like his life, altered irrevocably by recent events, yet still fundamentally the same waters he'd navigated for decades. "When I found Rex swimming out there," he said slowly, "I thought I was just doing what anyone would do. Never imagined it would lead to this." He gestured vaguely, encompassing everything that had happened. "But you're right about new chapters. Been reading the same one for too long now." Emily's smile bloomed gradually, like sunrise over calm waters. "So you'll stay? At least until you decide about the early warning network position?" "Reckon I will," Frank agreed, surprising himself with how right the decision felt. "Though I should warn you, I snore something awful. Martha used to say it was like sleeping next to a tugboat engine." Emily laughed, the sound bright and unexpected in the aftermath of so much tension and trauma. "I spent 3 years on a research vessel with 15 marine biologists in close quarters. Trust me, I can handle snoring." Rex moved between them, resting his head on Frank's knee while his tail brushed against Emily's chair, a living bridge connecting them. Frank scratched behind the dog's ears, marveling at the journey that had brought them together. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "in all my years at sea, I've seen some pretty incredible things. Whales breaching so close they splashed the deck. Storms that turned day to night. Sunsets that painted the whole world gold." He paused, looking down at Rex's intelligent eyes. "But I never saw anything as remarkable as a dog swimming miles offshore to find help for someone he loved." "The capacity for loyalty in animals often surpasses our own," Emily observed. "No conditions, no hesitation, just pure devotion." "Makes you wonder who the higher species really is sometimes," Frank replied. They lapsed into comfortable silence, watching gulls wheel above the cypress trees while the distant ocean continued its eternal rhythm against the shore. After a while, Emily's hand found Frank's across the table, and he didn't pull away. Rex, sensing the moment's importance, remained perfectly still between them, a silent witness to the beginning of something neither had anticipated. In the days and weeks that followed, the California coast began its long recovery. Frank salvaged what little he could from his destroyed cottage. Martha's wedding ring, miraculously found in the debris, a few water-damaged photographs, the brass barometer that had guided his fishing trips for decades. The rest was gone, claimed by the sea that had both sustained and now partially destroyed his life. But as summer turned to fall, new routines established themselves. Frank accepted the position coordinating the civilian early warning network, finding unexpected satisfaction in sharing his knowledge with younger fishermen and coastal residents. Emily's research into the thermal vent activity gained international recognition, her team developing monitoring systems that would provide crucial advance warning of similar events worldwide. And Rex, the extraordinary German shepherd who had connected them, became a local celebrity. His story of devotion and heroism inspiring articles, children's books, and even a documentary. He accepted the attention with typical canine grace, seemingly satisfied as long as he could remain close to both Emily and Frank, the humans he had chosen. On a clear October evening, 6 months after the tsunami, Frank stood at the helm of the fully restored Second Wind, guiding the vessel into deeper water for an overnight research expedition. Emily worked nearby, calibrating sampling equipment with practiced efficiency despite the boat's gentle rolling. Rex stood at the bow, his powerful form silhouetted against the setting sun, ears alert and posture confident as he scented the ocean breeze. Frank adjusted course slightly, feeling the familiar response of the boat beneath his hands. So much had changed, yet some things remained blessedly constant. The sea's eternal presence, the satisfaction of skilled work, the comfort of companionship after years of solitude. "Beautiful evening," Emily commented, moving to stand beside him at the wheel. "That it is," Frank agreed. "Sea's giving us perfect conditions." "It owes us that much, I think," she said with a smile, slipping her arm through his in a gesture that had become natural over the intervening months. Rex returned from his bow watch, circling once before settling at their feet, his mission of bringing these two humans together long since accomplished. Frank looked down at the extraordinary dog, then at the remarkable woman beside him, and finally out at the vast ocean that had nearly taken everything from him, but had ultimately given him something precious instead, a second chance at living rather than merely surviving. "You know," he said, echoing words spoken months earlier but now carrying deeper meaning, "sometimes the good Lord sends help in the most unexpected packages, and sometimes the ones we rescue end up rescuing us right back." As the Second Wind sailed steadily into the gathering dusk, Frank Wilson knew with absolute certainty that he had found his way home at last, not to a place, but to people. To connections that had begun with a desperate dog swimming against impossible odds, carrying not just the hope of rescue, but the promise of renewal for all their lives. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, a reminder of both danger and possibility. But Frank wasn't afraid anymore. Whatever currents awaited, they would navigate them together. An unlikely family forged in crisis, bound by courage and sustained by love in its most loyal and unconditional form. Folks, isn't it amazing how life's greatest blessings often arrive when we least expect them? Frank's story reminds us that even in our golden years, after we've weathered loss and settled into solitude, the universe can surprise us with new beginnings. Like Frank, many of us have known the pain of losing a spouse, the emptiness of a too quiet house, the routine that keeps us going but not truly living. But his journey shows us that it's never too late for second chances, whether they come in the form of a heroic German shepherd swimming against impossible odds or a connection with someone who sees our value when we've forgotten it ourselves. Frank didn't seek adventure or romance at 67, yet both found him when he simply followed his instinct to help a dog in distress. Remember, your next chapter might begin with one small act of kindness or courage. The sea of life still holds wonders, even for those of us with weathered hands and silver hair. Have you ever experienced an unexpected blessing that changed your life's direction when you thought your path was set? Or like Rex, have you witnessed extraordinary loyalty from an animal companion that touched your heart? Share your story below. We'd love to hear how the unexpected has brought joy to your journey.